Have you ever looked around your home and felt suffocated by your own belongings? Maybe you've held on to that broken appliance for years, telling yourself you'll fix it someday. Maybe your closets are overflowing with things you haven't touched in a decade. Or perhaps you know someone who lives surrounded by towers of newspapers, boxes of memories, and objects they can't bear to release. And when you suggest throwing something away, you see panic flash across their face. Real, visceral panic. As if you're threatening to take away a piece of their soul. Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who explored the deepest corners of the human psyche, understood something most people miss. He said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." And this is exactly what obsessive accumulation is. It's not about the stuff. It's never about the stuff. It's about what the stuff protects you from feeling. It's about the empty spaces inside that feel too terrifying to confront. Today, we're going to explore something society treats as a quirk, a bad habit, or simple laziness. But it's none of those things. Obsessive accumulation is a psychological survival mechanism. It's a fortress built object by object, a buffer between you and the world, a physical manifestation of internal chaos that can't be named. And by the end of this, you'll understand not just why people accumulate, but what they're really holding on to beneath all those objects. If you're ready to understand the hidden psychology behind hoarding, accumulation, and why letting go feels impossible for some, make sure you're subscribed. We're about to go deeper than surface-level explanations into the soul of what makes someone choose objects over space, possessions over peace. Hit that subscribe button now, because this journey requires courage. Let me start with something that might surprise you. Obsessive accumulation is not laziness. It's not messiness. It's not even about being disorganized. Obsessive accumulation is a symptom of profound emotional dysregulation. It's your psyche's desperate attempt to create safety, control, and meaning in a world that once felt unpredictably dangerous. If this is already shifting how you see accumulation, hit that subscribe button, because what comes next will completely transform how you understand the relationship between objects and emotional survival. Viktor Frankl, who survived the concentration camps where prisoners were stripped of everything, understood something disturbing yet profound about human attachment to objects. He watched people cling to a piece of bread, a photograph, a scrap of cloth, not because of the object's value, but because it represented their last thread of autonomy, their final proof that they still existed as individuals. He said, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." Whoa, but what happens when that freedom was taken from you before you were old enough to understand you had it? What happens when your childhood taught you that nothing was truly yours, that loss was always imminent, that control was an illusion? You begin accumulating, not consciously, not deliberately, but compulsively, because objects, unlike people, can't abandon you. Objects, unlike love, can't be withdrawn. Objects are predictable, controllable, permanent in ways that human connection never was. Think about what accumulation really represents. It's not about wanting more, it's about fearing less. Every item someone refuses to discard is anchored to a story, a fear, a moment when they felt powerless. And releasing that object feels like releasing the last evidence that their pain was real, that their history matters, that they existed through what they survived. Let me take you somewhere most psychology doesn't go. The root of obsessive accumulation is often emotional scarcity, not material scarcity, though that can trigger it, but emotional scarcity. Imagine growing up in an environment where emotional needs were consistently unmet, where love was conditional, unpredictable, or absent, where you learned that asking for what you needed resulted in rejection, punishment, or being made to feel like a burden. So you stopped asking. You stopped needing, or at least you pretended to. But human beings have needs. We need connection, validation, security, love. And when those needs can't be met through relationships, the psyche finds substitutes. Objects become emotional placeholders. That collection of magazines represents the knowledge you were denied. Those boxes of broken things represent the parts of yourself no one helped you fix. That pile of gifts you've never used represents the love you couldn't accept because you never learned how to receive. Sigmund Freud identified what he called the anal retentive personality, characterized by obsessive orderliness, parsimony, and retention. But beneath the clinical language is something more human. Freud understood that holding on, whether to objects or control, stems from early experiences where letting go resulted in shame, loss, or punishment. The child who was shamed for accidents, for messes, for natural expression, becomes the adult who can't release anything, because releasing feels like losing control, and losing control feels like annihilation. Now here's where it gets really complicated. People who accumulate obsessively aren't irrational. They're hyper-rational within their own traumatized logic. Every justification they give for keeping something makes perfect sense from inside their psychological framework. I might need this someday translates to, I can't trust that resources will be available when I need them. This was expensive means I can't bear to acknowledge that I made a mistake or wasted something valuable because that confirms I'm worthless. Someone gave this to me actually means discarding this feels like betraying the only proof that someone cared about me. These aren't excuses. They're windows into a worldview shaped by deprivation, unpredictability, or loss. And until you understand the worldview, you can't understand the behavior. When you see piles of clutter, the person living in it sees security. When you see trash, they see potential. When you see chaos, they see a protective barrier against a world that once hurt them too deeply. Donald Winnicott, the psychoanalyst who specialized in child development, introduced the concept of transitional objects. The teddy bear a child can't sleep without. The blanket they carry everywhere. These objects, Winnicott explained, represent the bridge between self and other, between internal security and external reality. They help a child tolerate separation from the caregiver because the object holds symbolic safety. But what happens when that developmental stage never completes? What happens when the child never develops enough internal security to release the external object? The transitional object becomes permanent, and then it multiplies. One comfort object becomes 10, becomes 100, becomes thousands. Because the internal void never filled, the external accumulation never stops. Let me paint you a picture. There's a woman named Susan. Her home is filled floor to ceiling with shopping bags, clothes with tags still on, kitchen gadgets she's never opened. To anyone visiting, it looks like compulsive shopping, materialism run amok. But here's what they don't see. Susan grew up in extreme poverty. Not just financial poverty, but emotional poverty. Her mother was depressed, unavailable, lost in her own survival. Her father left when she was 5. She learned early that she was on her own. Now, as an adult with financial stability, Susan buys things constantly, not because she wants them, but because the act of acquiring temporarily fills the emptiness. Each purchase is a small hit of dopamine, a momentary feeling of abundance where scarcity once dominated, but she can't use any of it. Because using it means it's gone. Consuming means losing. So everything stays sealed, saved, accumulated. Her home isn't a living space. It's a museum to the childhood abundance she never had. It's proof that she's no longer the powerless, deprived child. Except she still is, because she can't access any of what she has. Now let's talk about something people find disturbing: the shame spiral. Because accumulation doesn't just create physical clutter, it creates psychological imprisonment. The person knows, on some level, that their living situation isn't normal. They see how others react. They hear the judgment. They feel the shame. And shame, as Brené Brown extensively researched, is one of the most corrosive emotions we can experience. It attacks our sense of worthiness, our belief that we deserve love and belonging. So what happens? They isolate. They stop inviting people over. They avoid relationships that might expose their secret. They build walls not just with objects, but with distance. And the isolation feeds the accumulation because now there's no external accountability, no social motivation to change, no mirror showing them what their life has become. They're trapped in a cycle where the behavior that's supposed to create safety actually creates more danger, more shame, more isolation. Here's the terrifying irony. The accumulation that started as protection becomes a prison. The objects meant to create control create chaos. The possessions supposed to fill emptiness become the very thing that prevents connection, the only thing that could actually fill the void. It's a psychological trap where the solution becomes the problem, and the person is stuck not because they're stubborn, but because they literally cannot see another way to survive. Friedrich Nietzsche said something that applies devastatingly here. He said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But what happens when you don't have a why? What happens when your sense of purpose, identity, and meaning has become so entangled with your possessions that releasing them feels like self-destruction? That's when accumulation becomes identity. "I'm a collector" sounds better than "I'm traumatized." "I'm sentimental" sounds better than "I'm terrified of loss." "I might need this" sounds better than "I don't know who I am without my things." The objects become more than possessions. They become the structure holding a fragile sense of self together. And suggesting someone just clean up is like suggesting they just stop being themselves. It's not that simple. It's never that simple. Let me take you even deeper. Obsessive accumulation is often linked to what psychologists call complicated grief. Not just grief over death, but grief over what never was. Grief over the childhood you deserved but didn't have. Grief over the parent who couldn't love you properly. Grief over opportunities lost, relationships failed, potential unrealized. And when grief can't be processed, when it can't be felt and released, it gets converted into something else. Sometimes it becomes depression, sometimes addiction, sometimes it becomes physical illness, and sometimes it becomes accumulation. Every object becomes a memorial to something lost. Every pile becomes a gravesite for feelings that couldn't be buried properly. The person isn't living with clutter. They're living in an unresolved funeral, surrounded by everything they couldn't let themselves mourn. And suggesting they throw things away feels to them like you're asking them to dishonor the dead, to pretend their pain never mattered. Melanie Klein, the psychoanalyst who developed object relations theory, understood that humans don't just relate to people. We relate to objects as if they were people. We project onto them. We imbue them with meaning, memory, emotion. For someone with unresolved attachment trauma, objects become safer than people. They don't judge. They don't leave. They don't disappoint. A pile of newspapers is more reliable than a parent who is inconsistent. A collection of broken appliances is more loyal than a partner who abandoned you. This is why cleaning out a hoarder's home without addressing the psychology doesn't work. You can remove every item, scrub every surface, and within months, sometimes weeks, it's back. Because you removed the symptom without treating the cause. The emptiness is unbearable. The silence is deafening. The space itself becomes the threat. So the accumulation returns, faster and more desperate than before. because now they've lost even the illusion of control. Here's something most people never realize. The person accumulating is not the one in control. They feel completely out of control. They're terrified of their own behavior. They're ashamed of how they live. They're desperate to change but don't know how. Because changing isn't about discipline or organization. It's about confronting the emotional truth underneath. And that truth is usually too painful to bear alone. The truth might be, I was never loved the way I needed. The truth might be, I don't believe I deserve better than this. The truth might be, I'm terrified that if I let go of these objects, there will be nothing left. I will be nothing. And facing that truth without support, without therapeutic intervention, without compassion, feels impossible. So the accumulation continues, not as choice, but as survival. And this is where healing must begin, not with bins and labels and organizing systems, but with acknowledgement, with creating a safe space to finally feel what's been avoided, with grieving what was lost, with building internal security so that external objects aren't needed as emotional life support. James Baldwin wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." The person who accumulates must face not the clutter, but what the clutter represents. The fear, the loss, the emptiness, the unworthiness. And they can't do that alone. They need a witness. They need someone who can look at the chaos without judgment and say, I see you, I see your pain, and you deserve better than this. Because here's what nobody tells you. Underneath the accumulation is almost always a profound sense of unworthiness, a belief that says, I don't deserve clean space. I don't deserve beauty. I don't deserve peace. And that belief didn't come from nowhere. It was taught. Maybe through neglect, maybe through criticism, maybe through trauma. But somewhere, somehow, the message was internalized. You are not worth taking care of. And every day that person lives in chaos, that belief is reinforced. The clutter becomes proof. See, I really am worthless. Look at how I live. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, a psychological prison where the walls are built from shame and the bars are made from objects that were supposed to set them free. Let me tell you what happens when healing actually begins. It starts not with throwing things away, but with building something new. Building self-worth, building the capacity to tolerate discomfort, building trust that needs can be met without hoarding resources. It's slow, it's non-linear. There are setbacks. There are moments of panic when even a small bag of trash leaving the house feels like self-betrayal. But gradually, something shifts. The person begins to see that they are not their possessions, that their worth isn't measured in what they own, that safety can exist in empty space, that less might actually mean more peace, more freedom, more room to breathe. This realization doesn't come from logic, it comes from experience. From tiny experiments in releasing and discovering they survive it, from feeling the anxiety peak and then, miraculously, subside, from learning that the wave of panic passes and they're still okay. Carl Rogers believed in what he called unconditional positive regard, the idea that every person has inherent worth, regardless of behavior, regardless of circumstances. For someone who accumulates obsessively, experiencing unconditional positive regard, perhaps for the first time in their life, can be transformative. To have someone see the chaos and not recoil. To have someone understand the pain without trying to immediately fix it. To feel worthy of love, even while living in what looks like disaster. That experience begins to rebuild the internal foundation that was never properly built in childhood. So how do you help someone who accumulates obsessively? First, you must understand this is not about the stuff. Never make it about the stuff. It's about safety, control, identity, and unprocessed trauma. Second, you offer compassion without enabling. You can say, I see this is hard for you. I'm here to support you, but I also believe you deserve to live in a space where you can thrive. Third, you help them access professional support. Therapy, specifically trauma-informed therapy, is essential because the accumulation is a symptom, and symptoms don't disappear until the underlying wound heals. You might also explore occupational therapy, support groups, or specialized hoarding disorder treatment programs. These provide structure, accountability, and community, all things the isolated accumulator desperately needs. Fourth, if they're ready to start releasing items, you go slowly, painfully slowly, one box at a time, one category at a time, and with each decision to discard, you help them process the emotions that arise. You validate their fear, you acknowledge their grief, you celebrate their courage, because each item released is an act of profound bravery. It's choosing growth over safety. It's facing the void instead of filling it. Now, I want to end with this. Obsessive accumulation is not the problem. It's a symptom. The problem is disconnection. Disconnection from self, from worthiness, from the belief that internal security is possible. And the solution is reconnection. Learning that you are enough without the armor. Learning that empty space isn't dangerous. Learning that you can lose things and still be whole. This reconnection doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, sometimes a lifetime process. But every step toward it is meaningful. Every moment of choosing to feel instead of filling is transformation. Every decision to create space instead of accumulating more is an act of self-love. The objects someone accumulates are not their enemy. They're their teacher. They're showing where healing is needed, where grief needs to be processed, where self-worth needs to be rebuilt. And when someone can finally turn toward that teaching with curiosity and compassion instead of shame and avoidance, the accumulation begins to loosen its grip. So if you're someone who accumulates obsessively, I want you to hear this. You're not lazy. You're not broken beyond repair. You're carrying pain that was never properly witnessed, never adequately held. And the very thing you're most ashamed of, your accumulation, is actually pointing the way toward your healing. It's saying, look here, feel this, honor what was lost, grieve what you never had. And then, finally, let yourself live in space instead of filling every inch of it with proof that you exist. This is the psychology of obsessive accumulation. Not a judgment, but an understanding. Not a condemnation, but a pathway to healing. And the invitation is to finally face the emptiness you've been running from, to discover that the void inside isn't fatal, it's human. And it can be filled not with objects, but with self-compassion, with connection, with the slow, steady work of becoming whole. I want to hear your story. What clicked for you in this video? Have you struggled with accumulation, or do you love someone who has? What pattern did you finally recognize? Share in the comments below. Your insight might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if this video helped you understand yourself or someone you love, share it with them. Sometimes understanding is the first step to healing.